Well, as Tyler said, today we are continuing on in our Vivid series. It's our look at the poetic books of the Old Testament. This week we are looking at a very well-known book, the book of Job. Now, it may seem odd to those of you who are familiar with the book of Job for us to have asked you to think about questions like, how are you really doing, or how is your heart? As a preparation for today's sermon, I will say that the book of Job is not usually thought of a book that leads us to these sorts of personal questions, but stick with us. There is a connection, and we'll get to it soon. The book of Job, which, by the way, is thought to be the oldest book in the Bible, is one of the best known and most frequently studied, not just books of the Bible, but books of all of ancient literature. When I was a freshman in college, I had to take a class entitled The World's Greatest Literature, and we read Job. And even in that secular literature class, it's where we studied this book that is about a man named Job and the way that he dealt with sudden tragedy. It struck a chord in the hearts of my fellow students. I was very surprised by it. Just a secular class, but it forced us to talk about important and difficult questions, and probably most importantly, it pushed us so that we had to admit what we really believed about God. This book is that kind of powerful book. And as I said earlier, it's an old book, and in the time that it was written, what people wanted from their dramatic works of literature wasn't at all what we want. What we want is action and plot. We want something to happen, and we want things to move. That's what we like in our books, and believe it or not, they didn't want anything like that in their ancient works. What they wanted was to hear speeches. Long speeches by the main characters, and they wanted those speeches to say something about the character of the person who was talking, and also to give us some wise instruction about the best ways to live. That, to them, was great entertainment. Now, it goes against everything that we want in a book, but the book of Job is unquestionably exactly what a person who lived 3,500 years ago was looking for in good entertainment. And this book gives them that. If there's a little bit of action, there are 42 chapters in the book of Job. And by the way, we're going to cover every one of them this morning. And we are. And their first two is action. A little bit of action, and then we get what? 40 chapters of speeches. Well, here, let's look at the book of Job together. You'll see exactly what I mean. It's on page 359 in the House Bible. Everybody needs a Bible because we're going to be going through, as I said, all 42 chapters. The author begins by giving us a description of Job. Actually, he doesn't describe Job. He describes Job's righteousness, and he does it by giving us two separate pictures of Job. The first one is really direct. If you look at the very first verse of chapter 1, it says, "In the land of Uz lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God, and he shunned evil." To say somebody is blameless is a strong statement. This meant that Job was a good man. But then the author uses a second way to show us that Job had God's blessing by giving us a description of his family and his possessions. And this author uses the ancient world's well-known meaning for numbers to make his point. Now look at verse 2. It says, he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. 7 is always the number for God. In the Bible, any 7 or combination of 7 means sevens. We're talking about God. And everybody in the ancient world wanted sons. And how many did Job have? He had 7. So that's like the perfect number of sons. And how many daughters did he have? 3. 7 plus 3 equals 10, and 10 is the number of perfection, always the number of perfection in the Bible. What happens when a little baby is born? We go, oh, he has 10 fingers and 10 toes. He's perfect. And so and in the Bible, anytime a 10 comes up, it's talking about perfection. And so Job has 10 kids, which is a symbolic, perfect family. And in verse 3, it goes on. He says, he owned 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels. Now we're getting into big tens. So he's got 10,000 animals in the first pair. So that's 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. So that's a lot. Anytime in the Bible when something gets repeated, you're supposed to take notice. If it's just 2 times, you really take notice. If it's 3 times, if it's 4, it's uber notice. And this is 10,000 animals. So it's what? This is a big number there. And then it goes on. It says he has what? He has 500 yoke of oxen. Well, every yoke carried 2 oxen, so that's how many oxen? 1,000. 10 times 10 times 10. Pay attention. That's what it's saying there. And he had what? 500 donkeys. 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys. Well, how many animals? 1,000 again. 10 times 10 times 10. I think you get the picture. This is Numbers telling us everything we need to know about Job. That he's righteous. He's what? He's even close to perfect. Why, and Job even worked really hard at keeping the rest of his family's relationships connected to God and on good terms with God. Look at verse 4. His sons used to take turns holding feasts. By the way, the word there in the Hebrew actually says having birthday parties, but for some reason birthday parties isn't cool or sacred enough for the Bible, so it just says feasts. It says, his sons used to take turns having birthday parties for one another, and in their homes, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the period of feasting had run its course, Job would send and have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's custom. The point is clear. Job was a righteous man. But then the scene changes abruptly. We're suddenly in the courts of heaven, and Satan is before God. And God asks Satan this in verse 8. He says, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And we know right away that God has been paying attention to Job. But Satan's response to God tells us that Satan assumes that the only reason that any of us love God is because we just want something from him. Listen to what he says in verse 9. He goes, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the works of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land, but stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will curse you to your face. What Satan was saying, oh yeah, Job is worried about his kids cursing you in his heart. But I'm telling you, God, if you take everything away from him, that Job guy will look you in the eye and curse you to your face. Well, God trusted Job so much that he took Satan on. He says, okay, Satan, you can take everything from him, but you can't harm him. And so in a few days, in the space of about 5 minutes, 3 different messengers come running up to Job to tell him that all 11,500 of his animals have either been stolen or burned up by fire, and that all of the servants who take care of those animals, except the 3 messengers, have been killed. And then we read this in verse 18, while the last messenger was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the older brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Can you imagine? I certainly can't. And yet we read that Job's response was to fall on the ground in worship before God and say in verse 21, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." And the Bible goes on to say, in all of this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. There's not a hint of Job going, "Where were you, Lord? How could you let this happen to me?" He didn't say anything like, "I want nothing to do with you anymore, God, because look what you've done to my life." No, there's not a hint of any of that. Can you imagine that? I can't. But it gets worse. Same scenario in heaven. Sometime later, Satan is before God, and God points out to Satan, "Did you notice the great response of Job when you did all this awful stuff to him? Did you notice that?" And Satan goes, "Yeah, well, Job is only worried about himself. He's only really worried about himself. He has his health. Touch him and he'll curse you to your face." And again, God is willing to trust Job. But he says this, you can take his health away, but you can't kill him. You can't kill him. And soon, Satan afflicts Job with a physical condition that is difficult to define. Now, a lot of times they'll just say that it's boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. That'd be bad enough. But that is not a good way to translate this because it's much bigger. And throughout all of the speeches that Job gives later, he keeps coming back to the things that have happened to him physically because of this affliction. And it's a long and it's a disturbing and stomach-turning list of things. I was going to give it to you, but it's so horrible that I just didn't even want to make you sick to your stomach. On this one, just take my word for it, okay? Just take my word for it. Yet, and remember, Job has no idea why this is happening to him. None. And yet, even though he ends up sitting in a pile of ashes, scraping his sores with broken pottery, he refuses to blame God. Now, his wife's got other thoughts. She says, "Look, would you just curse God and die, please?" And Job says, "Not on your life." Again, can you imagine this? I just can't. And while Job is sitting in the ashes in misery, three of his friends, their names are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar come, and they come to show their concern for him. And now we get to the part of the book of Job that all of our ancient friends would have just loved, because now the fun's to begin, the speeches. But the speeches can't quite begin, because what happens is when the three friends show up to see Job, they are so shocked by what they see, by the condition that he is in, that they just sit down in silence and sit there with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and nobody says a word. Nobody can say a word. Well, finally, after a week, Job himself breaks the silence, and in verse 25 of chapter 3, he says to his friends, "What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil." Well, this opens the door to Job's friends responding in some way to what he said. And the big speeches begin. Eliphaz goes first. Now, in the ancient world, it was a place where everyone in a community held the same ideas about things. They didn't encourage diversity of thought. It's like everybody had the same notion in a community about the way the world worked. And in Job's community, we know this to be true, that everyone in that community believed that if you were good, you would be blessed. And if you were a sinner, you would be punished. It was a given, and everybody agreed with it. Obey, live righteously, and get big blessing from God. Sin, live in disobedience, big punishment from God. And Job's three friends, they did not come to comfort Job. They came to help him come clean. They were certain that Job had done something secretly sinful that was horrendous, or God wouldn't have done this to him. Listen to what Eliphaz says in verse 17 of chapter 5. He says, Job, blessed is the man whom God corrects. In other words, somebody's correcting you here, Job. So do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. Well, Job is not going to have anything to do with that. He says, nope. He says, I haven't done anything wrong that needs correction. He says, if you want to know the truth, I simply want to die and end this agony. And when he says that, it makes his second friend really angry. The second friend is named Bildad the Shuhite. And I just have to stop and say that my wife said I have to tell you that Bildad was the shortest, smallest guy in the Bible. He was only a shoe height. Hey, come on, the Bible doesn't have many jokes. So anyway, you'll never forget that. Nothing else I say will stay. You'll remember that Bildad was little. Okay, on we go. He was mad at Job. And he says, you are simply trying to avoid God's justice by hiding your sin. Come clean, admit what you've done wrong, and let God's judgment work its course. And he even tells Job that the reason your children died was because they were up to something sinful too. In verse 20 of chapter 8, he says this, surely God does not reject a blameless man. Looks like you're being rejected by God here, Job. You must not be blameless. He says, God doesn't strengthen the hand of an evildoer. You're looking pretty weak to me, Job. And again, Job would have none of it. And what he says in response is found in chapter 10 in verse 2. Job says, this is what I want to say to God. Do not condemn me, but tell me what charges you have against me. You know, Job's firm stance, it really riles up the friend number 3, Mr. Zophar. Look at what he says. It's in chapter 11, verse 4. He says, Job, you say to God, my beliefs are flawless, and I am pure in your sight. And then he says, oh, I wish God would speak, that he would open his lips against you and disclose to you the secrets of wisdom, for true wisdom has two sides. In other words, you might think you're so smart, Job, but there's another side of it, and I want God to come and tell you what you did wrong. And then he says, this is really something. He goes, know this, Job, God has even forgotten some of your sin. In other words, you must have so much sin for all this to have happened that he's thinking about some of it, but some of it he's just let it go and forgotten about it. You see, all 3 of Job's friends believed that Job was an unrepentant sinner, and the proof was everywhere. But Job is unmoved, and for 2 chapters, he rails on how easy it is for people who don't have any trouble going on in their life to pass judgment on people who are having trouble in their lives. And the friends hold the line. They go, Job, you have done something. Would you just come clean? And Job refuses to admit he's done anything wrong, and it all ends in chapter 32, verse 1, and it says, so these men stopped answering Job, because he was righteous in his own eyes, or they were thinking he was righteous in his own eyes. And while all of this is going on, while they're going back and forth with all these speeches, did you see how quickly we got to chapter 32 there, these big speeches? It's like all this is going on, this young man named Elihu, he's been standing off to the side listening, and he's getting madder and madder and madder. He's mad at Job because Job looks like he's just trying to justify himself. And he's mad at the three friends because they've been accusing Job of stuff and condemning him, and they've got no proof that they've got anything on him. But he's not interested in getting Job to confess, and he's not interested in getting to change those three friends' minds. No, what he wants them to do is to remember who they're talking about here. You're dealing with God. Remember that? He says, Job, I've been listening to you, and it sounds like your attitude now is that it was worthless and ridiculous for you to ever live a righteous life because this is the way God treats you. And I think you better back up on that one, Job, because you're talking about God, and we don't have the ability to understand everything about God. And after he gives a whole bunch of examples in his big long speech, all the great things that God knows more about and how God is more powerful. And then in chapter 37, verse 23, he says, the Almighty is beyond our reach and exalted in power in his justice and great righteousness, and he does not oppress. Therefore, men, revere him. For does he not have regard for all the wise in heart? Finally, Job gets a little bit of good advice, some sane counsel. The counsel is we shouldn't mess with God even if we think we have a legitimate complaint. Now, that's not much help in the condition that Job is in, but at least it's true. And once he says that, then the unimaginable happens. Mr. Zophar gets his wish, and God speaks. Now, I'm going to tell you, what I want for God is to say to everybody, especially Job, this is what has been happening, guys. I want him to say, this has all been happening to you, Job, because I have so much faith in you. And I want him to turn to the three friends and say, hey, when bad things happen in people's lives, it doesn't mean they're sinning. And I want him to say, nothing in life is so cut and dry that we can lay it out in black and white like that. I want God to say that. I want him to say, Job, your response to all this misery in your life has been exactly what I thought it would be. Well done, Job. Well done. And God doesn't say anything like that. He doesn't say one word of comfort to Job. Nothing. And he never once even hints that he's had any kind of interaction with Satan. All he does is let everybody know who gets to ask the questions. And his first question to Job is, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? And from that point on, we get a big speech from God. We get 3 whole chapters where God questions Job. He goes, hey, where were you when I put the stars in the universe? Where were you when I made all those animals and the fish that fill the sea? Where were you when the plants were made? He says, where were you, Job? Did you do any of this? Who are you to accuse me of anything? It is a detailed, overwhelming, and humbling question, and Job has only one answer. We find it in chapter 40, verse 4. He says, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I have put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. And Job's final words to God are, surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. And the book ends. Now, we have a moment where God expresses his anger over Job's friends thinking they knew all about how God works in the world. And he lets them know, I'm not happy about that. And then he begins the restoration of Job. He gives him back his health. He gives him back his family. He gives him back his possessions. And we are left to wonder about it all. Wondering, why is it that Job is never told what happened to him? Why is it that God is not interested at all in explaining himself? And I can't help but admit this leaves me feeling a bit empty. I want answers. And I don't want answers just for Job. I want those answers for you and me. You know, in our lives, when unexpected things are happening, I wish we could just open our Bibles to the book of Job and go, look, here's the answer right here. But we can't. Now, I know that much of the staying power of this book is that it doesn't give us the black and white answers, that it leads us into honest conversations about the uncertainties of life. But I still wish that God's answer had been more direct. But again, like Job, who am I to question God? Now, that said, it isn't like I haven't found some concrete truths that we can hold on to in the book of Job. I have found some. For instance, and I mentioned this earlier, this book tells us that righteous people can and do suffer in life, and we should never assume that it has something to do with sin. It is true that people suffer the consequences of their bad choices and their bad behavior and actions. We do suffer those consequences. But it does not mean that when something terrible comes roaring into somebody's life out of nowhere, that there's hidden sin that God needs to take care of. This book tells me that often the answer to why is this happening in this life will be silence. Something else that's connected with that, this book tells me that God is not pleased when people think they have him all figured out. Now, I could talk a long time about this. I'm going to try to keep this really short. Okay? We better know what we're talking about if we're going to tell other people this is what God does and this is what God doesn't do. Amen. If we're wrong, there's only one person we got to answer to. Now, and that's God. I'm just going to tell you, if you're out there talking about me and telling people that Tim does this or Tim doesn't do this or all that kind of stuff, and it's wrong, I'm not going to be happy about it. Now think about God. When people go out, when preachers go out on the pulpit and they say, you do this and God will do that, and you do this kind of stuff, they speak that way. And if you don't know what you're talking about and you're wrong, you will lead people into despair. You're better to keep your mouth shut than to say anything about God in this manner. God is not pleased when we think we have him all figured out. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. Another thing that I've taken from this book is that when good things happen to people, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's anything wonderful about their character either. This book tells me that people can be like Job's friends, looking really good, but they need a change of heart. You know, our world tends to hold on to the notion that blessing, especially material blessing, means that our lives are pleasing to God. And that's an equally mistaken notion. Truth is that the world has systems that work for some people that just makes it possible for certain people to get ahead, and it has nothing to do with God's blessing on their righteousness. You know, I've been wondering about this a lot lately and thinking that if the book of Job had been written now instead of 3,500 years ago, if it had been written now in our community, and Satan was going to go before God, and one of us was the people he was talking about, he probably wouldn't say the same things to God. What he'd probably say is, you know, if you made old Tim the richest person in the world, and you made him the highest guy on the social strata, he's way high up there and popular and everybody knows about him, and you give him a whole bevy full of beautiful, athletic, brilliant children, why, he's going to think he's all that, God, and he's not going to curse you. He's just going to forget about you. Because that's what happens. I mean, that's a big problem. We think that when things are going well, we don't have anything to worry about. And I just have to say that the book of Job has taught me that I need to never take myself that seriously and never stop looking deeply into my own heart to see what's going on. And something else the book tells me, maybe this is the most important thing for us today, is that God is paying attention. Now, this is a hard one to believe. I can't tell you how many times that I have been unnerved by God's silence. Fortunately, this book tells me that it's normal to be unnerved by God's silence. Job tells us throughout his speeches that he felt uncertainty and rejection and fear and dismay and loneliness, just to name a few things that he felt, all because he was assuming he'd been abandoned by God, and I get that. But there's one thing the book tells us, and it is this, that God is aware of our circumstances, and he's not going to abandon us. I wish he'd be more direct at times, but I'm going to hold on to it, that God has promised he will never leave me or forsake me, no matter how terrible the situation is. God is paying attention. Something else the book tells me is that God says he's built justice into the foundations of the world. Now, this is everywhere in the book and when God is talking, and I'm just going to say this. I don't know how or when or what it's going to look like, but God has promised us that someday everybody's going to pay for what they've actually done, and everybody's going to be rewarded for their obedience, and he's going to take care of it someday, somehow. We can trust him on that one. He wouldn't tell us it over and over and over in this book if it wasn't true. And there's one last thing that I learned from Job, and this is probably the most important for me. This that I'm to serve God and to trust him out of my love for who he is, not because of anything I might gain from him, because I'm being obedient. You know, I am to serve faithfully no matter what the circumstances. And I have to trust that he will ultimately, even if it's in the next life, bring goodness to me for my obedience to him. Now, I know that the book doesn't end with a happy ending, but it's a realistic ending. I mean, life is full of sadness and suffering, and it can be confusing and bewildering. But just knowing that God is paying attention and that he cares about the details and that he's capable of moving us either through the suffering or removing the suffering, whatever he chooses, just knowing those things are true can help me have hope in the present. And so it gets me back to those questions we asked earlier. How is your heart? Do you believe that God knows and cares about you? Because your answer is going to make a huge difference. If you do not believe that he cares about you, you will be a different person than a person who lives, no matter what the circumstances are, knowing he is with you. Or how's your family? Do you trust God with your family? Your answer will make a big difference in the way you live. Or how's your health? Do you think that God actually cares about your health? How you answer will make a big difference. How is your life? Your answer makes a big difference. Job tells us that your heart, your family, your health, and your life are all in God's hands. And those are the same hands that created everything in the universe. They're the same hands that hold the future. And they are the same hands that are the hands that promised you that God will never leave us or forsake us, no matter the circumstances. That is the message of Job. I am with you always, even until the end of the ages. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this book. Thank you for opening your heart to us. And Lord, I pray that you will make us people who live in the faith that says you are with us and leading us, and that you love us and care for us. Help us to be people who represent your heart in the world in a way that people will be drawn to you. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.